there. But let's get more analysis. We're now joined by former United States diplomat Brooks Spector. Brooks, good evening to you. Thank you so much for joining us. I do want to start with the simplest question, and that being that was there an expectation that we would see entry of the U.S. in this conflict between Iran and Israel, certainly at this point, with all the contention it has caused inside of the U.S.?
Well, the simple answer, I guess, is that Donald Trump had repeatedly said that Iran should under no circumstances have nuclear weapons capabilities. And if that is true, then it signaled that there was something that was going to be done to make sure that could not happen. The difficulty in that problem, of course, is there's no absolute assurance, there's no clarity, and there's no consistent analysis that says Iran is on the cusp of making nuclear weapons. Yes, they were refining and concentrating uranium-235 up to about 60% levels of concentration. That's not quite close enough to be weapons grade, but it is, however, it is more than is necessary for commercial energy production and things like that. So there's a presumption that the Iranians were doing something other than simply making fuel for electrical production reactors. However, the president in the U.S., as your previous correspondent was saying, was feinting one direction and then carrying out a move the other way. And he's obviously, that is, Trump is obviously very pleased with himself for having managed to make that work. The problem, of course, is, and I suspect that's your next question, is what happens now and what happens going forward? And that is a really murky question.
Yeah, it is a murky question. And the reason why it becomes a murky question, you've already got, for instance, a UK defense source that has told BBC that military personnel in the US, UK military personnel in the Middle East were now on the highest level of alert. I mean, the pressure that this puts on the US's allies.
Well, the challenge is that the Americans have about 40,000 military personnel of one type or another scattered across the Persian Gulf and Arabian Peninsula. All of those bases, all of those facilities are well within the range of current Iranian missiles, not nuclear, obviously, but missiles that could carry serious conventional explosive punches, as we've seen with the launches and then the landings in Tel Aviv and in Haifa and places in between. And it is impossible to protect every single base everywhere in the Persian Gulf and the peninsula completely and totally from that kind of thing, just as it would be impossible to totally protect all of them from any sort of localized drone attack, localized improvised explosive device, even simply a truck bomb. And so everybody in a foreign uniform in that area is going to be on high alert. Their facilities are going to be on extra levels of guarding and attention. And one doesn't know what's going to happen next. Will the Iranians, for example, launch a missile or two at one of those facilities, hoping that it will stir chaos and confusion among the Americans? And if that happens, and if it causes fatalities, will the Americans then respond in some way, shape, or form against the Iranians beyond what has already happened? So my crystal ball is about as good as anybody else's on this, which means it's not very useful.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tough one to see what's going to happen. But of course, the world watching with great concern. I'm keen to hear just your perspective on, of course, we have to look at, how South Africa is speaking and responding. The president is speaking about how they are noting with great anxiety the entry of the U.S. into Iran. I want just your perspective on that, if South Africa is using the right words there. A lot of the conversation here in South Africa, certainly by some experts, are saying perhaps we should sit this one out. What do you make of that discussion?
Well, there's sitting out, and then there's engaging in some sort of measure to bring this down a level, to lower the temperature and the flame and the fighting. South Africa, as a country, as a government, has historically had, or certainly over the last 30, 40 years, has had good relations with Iran and continues to say that it does. It's had some awkward relations with the United States, but they still exist in a very significant way, both governmentally and then economically in the private sector, and obviously among people beyond government. There's nothing wrong with saying that we have great anxieties about this. We believe that there should be forums where we lower the temperature. The problem is, where are these forums and who is going to enforce the lowering of that temperature?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, what happens? Let me just say this. My greatest fear, truly, is that one of the Iranian missiles that is now, or the next day, 2, 3, 4 from now, hits a target in Israel. That's one of the holy sites for Islam, for Christianity, for Judaism, and causes grievous damage. Or alternatively, one of the Iron Dome defensive anti-missile devices, parts of it fall and cause something of the same damage. Who is going to be blamed, and how are people globally going to react to such a thing? I think badly is probably the best way to describe it, which is only going to make things worse. Obviously, what has to be built into all this is some sort of confidence improvement measure. And there's an interesting parallel. India and Pakistan a couple of weeks back were exchanging weapons fire and rockets and things like that over some deaths that had happened among tourists visiting India from Pakistan, if you remember. Both of those countries are nuclear armed. Neither of them got around to threatening using nuclear weapons on each other. But if things had gone badly, who knows what might have happened? And if that had been the case, then we would have been in the soup but good. And I think, all countries, whether it's South Africa or any of the other countries not directly involved in this crisis, have to figure out a way to somehow bring this one back under control. It doesn't mean there's going to be love between the Israelis and the Iranians, certainly, but there needs to be some way to get to the point where they're not throwing rockets at each other, and that Donald Trump doesn't decide to play the hero and do something else.
Yeah, I almost want to, and I know we did say that what happens next becomes incredibly murky, right? Because there are so many possibilities. And, you talk about some of your biggest concerns around military or sites that could be hit in the next few days. But I think about just the biggest sort of geopolitical discussion, right? Some reports that Iranian officials traveling to Russia to consult. I mean, what you make of the possible entry of Moscow, what we know has a massive strategic relationship with Iran. Big concerns, and perhaps too far down the line to be thinking about?
Well, the Russians at this point obviously have got their hands full with trying to defeat the Ukrainians in a war which they're not really winning. The Russians have in fact been borrowing or obtaining North Korean troops to supplement their own, and purchasing Iranian military equipment, drones and what have you. They're probably not in the position of doing much in the way of supplying Iran. They can be Iran's voice, perhaps, at the UN Security Council, where they're a permanent member, along with the US, Britain, France, and China. But I think the Russians probably see themselves as not wishing to get involved, but hoping somehow that this will make life a little more complicated for the Americans. Now, you're probably going to then ask, what about China? And I would add that the Chinese are probably watching this particular crisis with great interest and much attention, because it gives them some indications of how things might go should they try to conquer Taiwan. And that would be yet another crisis that would presumably involve the United States on behalf of Taiwan. So this particular conflict now, Iran and Israel, is still limited, but it has potentials for spilling over. It has potentials for influencing other conflicts, and it does have the potential, obviously, for drawing in other nations who feel that they need to support side A or side B.
Yeah, I'm going to move towards wrapping it up because thankfully you do predict the upcoming questions and then take care of that as well, Brooks. We appreciate that. But just lastly, before I let you go, some ideas on the sort of solutions that should be put forward by global institutions such as the United Nations. I think about how the International Atomic Energy Agency's latest report did warn that Iran had enough uranium to potentially create nuclear bombs, but some question around whether or not that is true, and the role of those international bodies at a moment like this to either stoke the fires or bring things to a simmer.
Well, it is true that the IAEA made that report, and they couched it in very careful bureaucratic language, as an institution like that would do. Cynically put, I think the Americans have made it all that much more difficult for the Iranians to create any sort of device from the uranium-235 that they do have on hand at the appropriate levels of concentration, if they have it. But at this point going forward, I think the IAEA needs to take a much more vigorous, not necessarily aggressive, but much more vigorous and forthright set of activities to ensure that something like this doesn't happen again. The other UN agency, obviously the Security Council, is going to have debates on this, but given the fact that the U.S. is a member of it, I don't see the Security Council making a particularly vociferous or consequential decision just yet. I think somehow this is going to have to play out in a way that gets the Iranians and the Israelis sitting down and talking, even though at this point they've been lobbing missiles at each other. Now that's a big ask for both nations, and it's a bigger ask to find a solution that comes out of that discussion. But that's where we're going to have to focus energies, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we're going to leave it there. Thank you so much for speaking to us. Brooks Spector, of course, former United States diplomat, chatting to us this evening.